So Moira, how does the diversity of Toronto communities affect the way that this program gets delivered?
When we take a look at the demographics of our schools, we know that it is either just a little bit under 50% or a little bit over 50% of the students in elementary and secondary who are new to the country.
I know the Toronto District School Board has policies and resources related to equity and accessibility of the Growth and Development Program. Would you like to share some of that information?
In terms of the teaching of puberty education or growth and human development, the three policies that I primarily work with from the Toronto District School Board are the equity policy, the Equity Foundation Statement and Commitments to Equity Policy Implementation, full title. The second policy would be the Human Rights Policy, that is for the Toronto District School Board. And then the third policy would be this one, which is Guidelines and Procedures for the Accommodation of Religious Requirements, Practices, and Observances. Teachers should be, in fact, quite aware of what these policies indicate. The first policy, the equity policy, identifies the 5 areas of equity, which are anti-racism and ethnocultural equity, anti-sexism and gender equity, anti-homophobia and sexual orientation equity, anti-classism and socioeconomic equity, and the last one is, of course, equity for persons with disabilities. This goes hand in hand with the Human Rights Policy, which identifies all the prohibited grounds that the board will find as grounds for discrimination. It's worth noting that within the prohibited grounds, as in the Ontario Human Rights Code, that oftentimes if members of the public or members of the TDSB community find it difficult, for example, to talk about sexual orientation, that sexual orientation is within the Toronto District School Board Human Rights Policy and is therefore human rights education. And then the Guidelines and Procedures for the Accommodation for Religious Requirements interacts with the Human Rights Policy. So, for example, if I know that in my area and my school population there is a high population of extremely devout students whose parents, guardians, and caregivers would object to them attending puberty education or growth and human development classes, then a teacher must be prepared that, in fact, because we do guarantee accommodation, that the students may not be there in the classroom. You might have in some schools in the Toronto District School Board maybe 50% of the class attending that day. So the teacher just has to be aware of that. But they should also be aware that there are set procedures for applying for faith accommodation and that the parents, guardians, and caregivers are responsible for knowing, fully knowing, that in fact if they exempt their child, then their child is just not going to receive the information. A child cannot come up to you on the day of and say, I'm not allowed to be here. Okay? What has to be clarified with that child's family and caregivers is that, in fact, the caregivers fully know that the child wants to be exempted and that they agree. Because in the elementary, middle school, and secondary school panels, we do find that, in fact, students will say stuff that maybe their parents aren't really 100% with.
Yes, exactly.
I think also in terms of guidelines and procedures for accommodation of religious requirements, practices, and observances, and the human rights policy, it's important for teachers to know that, in fact, it also affects them because they are members of the Toronto District School Board communities. And that is, if they practice a faith and they have a set of values and beliefs that, for example, if they feel uncomfortable with discussing or teaching certain topics to their students, the bottom line is that we don't really have that luxury because they are Toronto District School Board public employees. We all live with these policies, and so their job is to teach. So it doesn't really matter what my faith background might tell me that I'm okay in doing. If I'm going to fulfill the role and responsibilities of being a teacher, then I go ahead and I teach it. That doesn't mean that there isn't flexibility within the school. There is always flexibility to negotiate things so that if my degree of discomfort is extreme, then perhaps I might be able to work something out as long as I allow, or I let the principal know or other teachers know so that we can negotiate something, right? For my level of discomfort, however, the Toronto District School Board has put out a document called a teaching resource for dealing with controversial and sensitive issues in TDSB classrooms. Now, growth in human development is not a controversial and sensitive issue, nor is it a human rights issue. It is just what it is. It's curriculum that's generated by the Ontario Ministry of Education. The expectations are what we are supposed to convey to the students. However, what is very helpful in this document is the teaching learning strategy that is explained, called the role of the reader. And the very first step of the role of the reader strategy is to do a bias analysis, not of the students, but of yourself as a teacher. And that is, how do you feel about talking about growth and human development topics, sexuality, reproduction, et cetera, with your students? Then just going through the process of self-reflection and doing a bias analysis puts you in a spot as a teacher of stepping back. And the main question that this document wants to address to teachers is, are you really in a capacity or a profession where it is just a perpetuation of your own personal sets of biases? And we're not. We're not in this game for doing that.
Was there a time when your parents were invited to come and have an information session, or?
No, that was not done.
Right. And do you think that would be helpful in certain communities, or?
I do think that would be extremely helpful. I think that it would be wrong, even though we do have a very diverse community, ethnically, linguistically, racially, culturally diverse communities, with many newcomer families, that it would be wrong to assume that they are not interested in what their children are learning. And so if they were invited and they were made aware of, in fact, what was going to be taught, they might, in fact, be able to fill the other role, and that is how to support the learning at home.